Hello, welcome to the Socialist Legacy. I'm Reed Kane, and we are streaming live on the Sublation Media Twitch channel. If you're watching this video after the fact, you can catch us live on the Sublation Media Twitch channel every Tuesday night at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. And if you're watching this on Twitch, you can find um, past videos on the YouTube channel. The YouTube channel is Socialist Legacy. I will mention at the outset that I will be on hiatus for the next 2 weeks. So there won't be any live streams next week or the following week. I'm going to be traveling to visit family, but I will be back in 3 weeks' time. So that'll be July 12th, and we'll recommence our regular schedule of broadcasts then. Okay. So I also wanted to mention before we begin, if you didn't catch it, I was a guest. I was actually the first guest on the Sublation Magazine show, a new YouTube live streaming show that Doug Lane is doing on the Sublation Media YouTube channel. So you can find the video of that discussion, that interview, on the Sublation Media YouTube channel. I was discussing an article I published in Sublation Magazine on Marx and contradiction. And I will also be a guest on Derek Varn's YouTube channel, discussing the same topic but at greater length. I believe that interview is going to be posted on July 1st, so a little over a week. I think it's scheduled to go up at 7 p.m. Eastern time, I think. But you can find that scheduled video on his YouTube channel. So definitely check that out if you're so into these live streams that me being away for 2 weeks will be especially difficult. Then hopefully that'll tide you over. I'd be amazed to learn that anyone has that, that sort of perspective. But be that as it may, so I wanted to begin this week what will probably be an extended discussion over several different streams of particularly of two pieces written by Hal Draper in the early 1970s. One is titled "The Anatomy of the Microsect," and the other is titled "Toward Another Road." Let me get the full title. It's kind of a strange title. Toward a New Beginning on Another Road: The Alternative to the Microsect. They're kind of two versions of the same argument. They have some slight differences between them, but they're kind of two pieces of the same argument ultimately. And I'm only gonna probably touch on these pieces a little bit sparingly today. I want to um, kind of expand on the discussion that we've been conducting thus far on the sort of political perspective of, well, in particular, Seth Ackerman, as laid out in his article that we've devoted a few sessions to, the Blueprint for a New Party article, but also more generally the perspective of Jacobin magazine and its founding editor, Bhaskar Sunkara, and relatedly, the sort of political perspective of DSA, not necessarily as a kind of official organizational perspective, but you might say the kind of general orientation of a lot of its membership, probably its more active and devoted membership, and to some extent its official perspective as well. This is a topic that I want to go into a lot of depth in terms of the genesis of Draper's perspective, on the basis of his experience in the socialist movement. I don't want to go into that today. I'm gonna kind of raise Draper's critique of the sectarianism of the left in his time, over the course of his life, really, but especially at the end of the 60s and going into the 70s, as a lens through which to approach the critique of the kind of Jacobin perspective, the Marxist critique of the Jacobin perspective that I have been sort of um, laying out piecemeal over the course of several live streams now. So I just recently watched an interview that Doug Lane did with Bhaskar Sankara on the Sublation Media YouTube channel, and I will link that in the description of the YouTube video if you're watching this after the fact. And I wanted to kind of point out a few things that came up in that interview. I also just watched. This was from that interview with Doug was recent. I think it was just this past week. Um, I also just before I went live, I just finished watching a panel discussion that's from, I think, a few months ago, hosted by DSA's political education committee, I believe. That was between Bhaskar Sankara, Seth Ackerman, and Mike McNair of the CPGB, who is going to come up in the discussion today. I think I mentioned him last time as well. And there was another. I apologize. I do not recall the name of the fourth panelist, but she was involved in the drafting of the DSA's platform. I think that both the New York City or New York chapter platform and the national platform. And not to dismiss her contributions, they were very interesting, but they weren't exactly to the point that I was interested in. That second video I only just finished watching. I didn't really have a chance to take any notes on it, but I will probably bring up a few things that came up in that video as well. So I'll also link that in the comments, as well as the Draper pieces I mentioned. So Bhaskar, in his interview with Doug Lane, so Doug asked Bhaskar about his sort of aspirations as his kind of literary aspirations, in the sense of being a publisher of a magazine and other material. And Bhaskar clarified that he didn't set out with any real ambitions vis-a-vis the literary world, or as a kind of literary figure in the sense of a publisher or writer per se, but rather he viewed Jacobin magazine and his earlier editorial work for the YDS, the Young Democratic Socialists blog, the activist, but especially Jacobin magazine, he viewed not as a merely literary enterprise, but as a political intervention seeking to advance particularly political ideas. So as a kind of mouthpiece for his political perspective, trying to get his ideas out there, popularize his political ideas. And he made reference to Hal Draper's idea of the political center as his reference point. So he viewed his founding of Jacobin magazine, the purpose of Jacobin magazine, as in line with what Draper was describing, particularly in the pieces that I mentioned earlier, in terms of the political center, a political center. And we'll get to what that means in a bit if you haven't read those pieces. Pardon me. In terms of what his political perspective that he was trying to promote, publicize, propagate what that perspective is, it involved initially a prognosis with respect to left politics in the US, namely that there is, or at the time there was, no real left in US politics. And that this was the result of, he didn't put it quite this way, but I think the implication was that this was the result of essentially the Popular Front strategy of subordinating of leftist organizations, specifically socialist and communist organizations, subordinating themselves to the Democratic Party in the name of fighting the right, in the name of a popular front against extreme right wing politics, specifically fighting against fascism or the incipient fascism represented by the Republican Party. This and then along with this sort of liquidation of the left as a meaningful political presence in the US, the civil society organizations of the labor movement, above all the trade unions, but there are maybe other organizations he had in mind as well. He specifically mentions the trade unions have been hollowed out as a result of defeats. He doesn't specify exactly what defeats or what this period of defeat and consequent recession is, but it presumably at least goes back to the 70s and 80s, if not earlier. So to deal with this situation, Bhaskar Sankara has this perspective that something has to be done in a sort of desperate situation in which there is no real left, and the labor movement, to the extent that it exists at all, is hollowed out and lacking um, the sort of initiative and drive and desire to escalate its struggle in any kind of substantial way. Certainly, any way that would involve taking on an independent political expression. And it's to this purpose that he eventually, I'm not sure exactly when he arrived at this perspective, but by the eve of the uh, campaign season for the 2016 presidential election, so before Bernie Sanders had announced his candidacy, but in the lead up to that announcement, Sankara sort of came up with this idea that to revive both left politics and the labor movement, something along the lines of a left populist electoral strategy would be desirable, would help facilitate that end. And it was for that reason that he, before Sanders announced, was part of an effort to draft Bernie Sanders to run for president. Um, he did this, and then, of course, after Sanders announced, he supported Sanders, not with the expectation that Sanders would win or even necessarily do very well in the race. I think he said that he hoped Sanders would come in a distant second. That was his initial expectation. But rather, through the campaign, through the Sanders campaign, to establish an oppositional profile for the left, distinct from the Democratic Party mainstream. This would in his this he hoped that this would bring together and energize discontents in society with economic inequality and other related issues that are not given a great deal of um, emphasis, or that aren't really substantively addressed by mainstream Democrats, or for that matter, Republicans. He also um, he also appreciated with respect to Sanders, the rhetorical invocations of the class struggle and socialism, which for the sake of alluding to a deeper history of left politics and socialist politics, but nonetheless kind of maintaining a broad enough appeal that these sorts of rhetorical flourishes um, didn't alienate the kind of regular voter who might not be committed to these things and who might even have some sort of who might be wary of this sort of language in other contexts. Sankara says that the project of rooting left politics in the working class could then proceed by engaging working class elements in such a left-wing populist upsurge. And in this light, the Ackerman plan for a new party that we've previously discussed, which Ackerman in the panel discussion I just mentioned says when he wrote that article, he was not thinking of DSA in particular becoming this new party, but maybe facilitating its eventual emergence or kind of serving as a kind of precursor that would eventually lead to the sort of strategy that he's describing there, which, maybe that's true, but I do think that there was a calculation with respect to that article in particular and that whole issue of Jacobin of making an argument for the future orientation of the DSA in the aftermath of the Sanders campaign. And I don't think that's much of a stretch. Um, that doesn't, again, necessarily mean that Sankara and Ackerman and the other editors of Jacobin were looking for DSA to kind of immediately take up this strategy and run with it. But I do think that their long-term goal was for DSA or perhaps some merger of DSA and some other sectarian organizations would eventually take this strategy up and on that basis lead to the development of a new political party. So the Ackerman plan in this light is a plan for an organization to carry on the kind of left populist electoral strategy of the Sanders campaign beyond the Sanders campaign. So how to keep the sort of energizing and galvanizing effect that Sankara thought the Sanders campaign could have and did have to some extent going beyond its end. How to keep that alive so that it could have a more sustained effect. Well, if you are building an organization that is running candidates that take the same essential political orientation as Sanders did, even if it's in lower level races, whether that be for Congress, the federal legislature, or state level races, or even local elections, you nonetheless could have a sort of knock on effect of sustaining the Sanders moment beyond the Sanders campaign. Winning such elections and even winning the presidency is not only not enough to achieve the ultimate goal in Sankara's eyes. So the point is not that Sanders winning would lead us to socialism directly, or if DSA or whatever inheritor organization takes over from DSA, becoming a new political party, electing, a majority in Congress, say, and electing a president, these things in Sankara's eyes wouldn't in and of themselves lead to socialism, but rather would only be the beginning of rebuilding a working class movement. Sanders, for example, would need mass organization and action in society to force through his policies if he became president. And from this, a real movement could be developed. So Sankara raises the example of Trump inciting his supporters to storm the Capitol on January 6th. as an example of the kind of relationship a president might have to his supporters in society and the kinds of action that might be taken. And I don't think he had in mind that Sanders would like call upon his supporters to storm the Capitol or things like that. But rather that there would be various forms of action taking place in the streets, so to speak, that would demonstrate mass support for the kinds of policies Sanders is trying to pass, and that would put pressure on the Democratic Party politicians and perhaps Republican politicians as well in Congress, as well as the bureaucracy, the executive bureaucracy that Sanders would be forced to work with, inevitably staffed by Democratic Party functionaries, as well as civil service bureaucrats that are more deeply embedded than even such politicians are in the state. Sanders would have to work with these kinds of people, and in order to get anything done against their, over their opposition to the sorts of policies he was advocating, it would take a great deal of pressure coming from people in society. And so that sort of mass action in support of Sanders and his policies, that for Sankara could eventually be developed into the basis of some kind of mass working class movement. So he's a little more circumspect about the prospects of a movement of that sort developing out of the Sanders campaign directly, which was something that Adolph Reed, for example, was hopeful about during the Sanders campaign. He has since sort of recanted on that optimism and kind of sees that as having been naive, I think. But the kind of the ultimate point here is that Sankara has this very long-term perspective on what it would mean, what it would take to revive uh, a working class socialist politics in the United States. And the initial steps, based on where we are, involve keeping socialist ideas alive, which is his sort of primary objective with Jacobin magazine, to keep these left-wing and socialist ideas alive so that they will eventually, when they become really substantially applicable again, someone will have been passing them down to the generation down the line in probably several decades, who will make good on them. And beyond that, sort of stoking the discontents in society that could eventually lead to the development of some kind of mass working class movement, and through which the cadre, the kind of activists, the functionaries of a socialist politics would begin to develop themselves, begin to develop politically, if only in a very rudimentary form, in this kind of left populist, quasi socialist, progressive, left wing Democrat mode. And this is something that both Sankara and Ackerman reiterated on that panel discussion, that they don't see DSA in the present or even at any point in the relatively near term future being a political party, or even the kind of immediate precursor, like on the verge of becoming some kind of socialist party or working class party, but rather that they are sort of stirring up, agitating a discontents that could be rolled into such a movement at some point in the future. But the main point is to energize this mass of society that has been essentially kind of a sleeping giant for several decades, if not longer, sort of just passively suffering for the most part what has been imposed upon it by the existing social order. Ackerman also puts it a little bit differently, but essentially making the same point in response to a point of Mike McNair, which is essentially, well, it's not just in response to Mike McNair. I think this was his initial remark, but it does kind of counterpose him to McNair's perspective in that panel discussion, that the working class politics of previous epochs, of the earlier working class socialist movements around the world, of the 19th and early 20th centuries, could rely on a sort of immediacy of the distinction between the working class and the ruling class, between the proletariat and the capitalists, um, and specifically of the kind of political antagonism that this amounted to ultimately. There was a sort of immediate and obvious character of this class division and antagonism, and that this was rooted in what he describes as the more caste like character of class relations in that period, as compared to today. The class division in society does not have such a caste like character. It's not so kind of on the face of things, but is more of a kind of background condition that's less emphasized openly and that's less obvious to people. That's sort of hidden behind the appearances of things. And that we have this kind of more default, if you like, liberal perspective of being members of a society, not members of classes that are in conflict in a manner that is undermining any kind of united social organism or social order. So for Ackerman, this sort of left populist electoral strategy would serve to begin moving people in the direction of thinking in terms of class conflict and class struggle, not by like making an immediate appeal in class terms, or perhaps at best doing the kind of rhetorical move that Sanders does of invoking a kind of conception of a class struggle going on in society between, as Sanders puts it, the billionaire class and the working class, or um, you know the just regular people, however you want to think about it, which is not exactly the conception of class struggle in, say, a Marxist conception, or even a more old-fashioned socialist idiom more generally, but is at least moving in the direction of thinking in those terms of a politics oriented around some kind of conflict over economic interests, the material economic interests of working people vis-a-vis the people that rule in society, that control the wealth and power in society. So that's sort of where they're coming from with this perspective. Um, the goal of this Ackerman new party is not immediately to build a working class uh, party along the lines of the old Second International Socialist Party, say, or even the Labour Party in Britain, but rather to begin developing a sort of movement in the direction of that could eventually allow for that sort of organization to form and that sort of movement to form. Now, just to mention briefly something from that panel discussion that I want to bring back as I go on here. McNair pushed back on both Sankara and Ackerman during the panel in responding to them, essentially saying to them that their sort of hesitancy is uncalled for, and that there is no reason to put off forming the party until some eventual point down the road when we're ready for it. And that this idea of like preparing for such a party through a politics that we're not actually committed to, but is like a small step in the direction of the kind of politics that we want to advocate, is kind of is sort of misinformed with respect to the history. And he specifically invokes the example of the Social Democratic Party of Germany in its early days before it really took off. It was a relatively small party with respect to its membership, and was on the order of, in terms of its membership size, it was comparable roughly to the size of something like DSA. So his criticism was essentially, you should just form the party now. You should just announce yourselves as the party and do what you aim to do as the party, and you know quit putting it off, really. And I'll come back to that perspective shortly. Now, as I mentioned, Jacobin, Sunkara Ackerman, Jacobin magazine, while it has this sort of electoral orientation, it puts a lot of emphasis on the value of electoral politics, specifically this sort of left populist electoral politics, as facilitating the reemergence of a genuine left politics in the United States, and the re-energizing and revitalization of the labor movement. While they put a lot of emphasis on this, they, as I said, don't imagine that electoral politics on its own is sufficient, right? It's not sufficient even to rebuild that movement, let alone to reach the goal of socialism. They have this perspective that you need both the ballots and the streets, to put it in a kind of 60s idiom. So you need both the electoral action, political action in that sense, but you also need social action. You also need mass action, mass organized action in society in various forms that can back up what is represented in the electoral contests, and in the work of socialist representatives, elected representatives in, say, the legislature. You need both the ballots and the streets. And while DSA is criticized for having a kind of inordinate focus on electoral politics, there is certainly a substantial element in DSA that emphasizes this, if you will, anarchistic orientation towards social action, if not at the expense of electoral action, at least in a kind of preference to it, seeing it as more important to do this. And again, it doesn't necessarily have to be a preferential question. It can be a matter of strategically, a kind of strategic division of labor. You need both of these things. And even if the perspective is that to really have a substantial kind of current of social action and struggle in society, you need to reawaken people through these electoral contests and appeals in the electoral arena. Nonetheless, that doesn't necessarily exclude doing anything in society before or alongside that sort of activity. So something that came up in the discussion portion of the last live stream I did was the base building tendency. And this characterizes both this current in DSA oriented more towards social action or activism than electoral politics, but also a substantial, or what was, at least for a time, a relatively substantial phenomenon emerging outside of the DSA. Um, so the perspective of this kind of tendency more generally is the need to organize a base for socialist politics in society through activism or social action, addressing the needs, struggles, discontents of people directly through collective action and organization, even if that's initially at a relatively small scale. The most kind of noteworthy form of this activism has been tenants organizing tenants unions, and this tendency is most outside of DSA most closely associated with a group called Philly Socialists, who organized a tenants union in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Tenants Union, I think it's called. But they also undertook to bring together other groups in other places around the country with a similar perspective in hopes of developing a sort of network, if not organization, um, that could help support this sort of work. Different groups doing this sort of work could help support each other, whether materially or intellectually or however, and kind of expanded and propagated in that way. Um, this was undertaken under the moniker of the Marxist Center, which that term, so I think initially it was the name of a Facebook group in which a number of these different people involved in this were sort of discussing these matters, and the name of that project, the Marxist Center project, points back both to Draper and the concept of the political center in Draper's piece articles, but it also points to Mike McNair's notion of the Kautskian Center in Second International Social Democracy, which for McNair is the position of Kautsky, the kind of orthodox position that was opposed to both the ultra left sectarianism and the right wing opportunist reformism and liquidationism that were on its respective flanks. Um, so McNair's neo Kautskian partyism is opposed, specifically, it's opposed to what McNair calls confessional sects, including sects of one. So sects being organizations. For McNair, sects are organizations based on a shared theoretical doctrine, agreement on a kind of theoretical doctrine, whereas political parties should be democratic organizations based upon agreement to a practical political program. So the specifically articulated points agreed upon by the membership in the program, and not some sort of effusive and ethereal theoretical perspective that can become the source of endless controversy, but without providing any kind of concrete practical guidance, besides helping to encourage various kinds of conflicts between members. And by sects of one, he's getting at how there's a tendency to have this sort of fissile attitude on the basis of theoretical um, commitments that is so intense that it sort of prevents people from organizing in any form at all, and rather leads to a kind of mass of individuals all essentially coming into that might come into conflict with each other on these sorts of questions at any moment, and hence do not constitute any kind of meaningful, organized, collective, entity. And this is sort of McNair's prognosis of what is, where the left is kind of at. There's still the sectarian organizations, the confessional sects, but more and more we're in this situation where the left is made up of a mass of atomized sects of one. But McNair's conception of the party in terms of a democratic organization based upon agreement to a practical political program is still sectarian by Draper's account, or at least it would still be sectarian by Draper's account under certain circumstances, and that would be the circumstances that we're presently in. So McNair's recommendation to just form the party now, and his effort to kind of do that with the Communist Party of Great Britain, are still sectarian, if in a different sense than how McNair means it, by Draper's reckoning. Now, before I go into what Draper means, I should mention, so in the Johnstone, we had a variety of different senses of the party in Marx and Engels. And the kind of conception of the party that Draper is focusing on are the various different forms of party organization as a mass organization, a mass political organization of the working class. There is also the sense of the kind of the germ of the party, or the party embryo, or the party in the process of formation, that Johnstone mentions. Now, that's a different idea, and Johnstone doesn't go into a great deal of detail about how that would be constituted, or how Marx and Engels thought that should be constituted, beyond describing how they actually conducted themselves in that condition when they were in that situation of being the party embryo, aspiring to the development of a mass working class party in a situation where it did not exist. And we'll see that this party embryo concept has a lot in common with what Draper talks about as the political center, which he bases on a kind of analysis of the political careers of Marx and Engels themselves, as well as Lenin. So Draper says, and this is in the alternative to the microsect article, to Marx, any organization was a sect if it set up a special set of views, including Marx's views, as its organizational boundary, determinant of its organizational form. The sect establishes itself on a high level, far above that of the working class, and on a thin base which is ideologically selective, usually necessarily outside the working class. Its working class character is claimed on the basis of its aspiration and orientation, not its composition or its life. It then sets out to haul the working class up to its level, or calls on the working class to climb up the grade. From behind its organizational walls, it sends out scouting parties to contact the working class, and missionaries to convert 2 here and 3 there. It sees itself becoming, one day, a mass revolutionary party by a process of accretion, or by eventual unity with 2 or 3 other sects, or perhaps by some process of entry. Marx, on the other hand, saw the vanguard elements as avoiding above all the creation of organizational walls between themselves and the class in motion. The task was not to lift up 2 workers here and 3 there to the level of the full program, let alone 2 students here and 3 intellectuals there, but to go after the levers that could get the class, or sections of the class, moving as a mass onto higher levels of action and politics. So this concept of a democratic organization and a big tent multi-tendency approach is not enough to overcome sectarianism on this model, and really only reinforces it. So this gets at a question that was asked of me last time, of how could I characterize DSA as being opportunist and sectarian at the same time, as those seem to be opposed determinations. Well, this is getting at that, how that might work. Such, so to speak, non-sectarian sects or sectarian organizations that are trying to overcome their sectarianism by way of internal democracy and openness to various perspectives rather than being formed along a very strict on a very strict line, adherence to a very strictly defined political line. Such non-sectarian sects, so to speak, will try to eschew distinguishing programmatic points. This is to be achieved by limiting the program to some minimum socialist or radical basis on which everyone can agree, i.e., a statement of abstract socialism. If a left wing wants to push the group to a revolutionary position, like no support to Democrats, the minimum is exploded. In practice, therefore, the program must be reformist. That's from the that's also from the that's from the anatomy of the microsect article. So they either abandoned principled positions in pursuit of concrete gains, and not so much gains for the working class movement, as for their own organization. So growth of membership and of dues revenue. Or otherwise, the clash between different positions will tend to tear the organization apart and lead it in a more resolutely sectarian direction, or lead whatever fractions emerge from a split in more resolutely sectarian directions. So there's a kind of back and forth between the desire of sectarian organizations to maintain themselves organizationally by opportunistically sort of bracketing or suppressing their principled positions, and and the inability of these sorts of organizations to mediate the kinds of conflicts that arise within them on questions of principle effectively, leading to splintering sectarianism in that sense. Draper says, furthermore, as long as the life of the organization, whether or not labeled party, is actually based on its politically distinctive ideas, rather than on the real social struggles in which it is engaged, it will not be possible to suppress the clash of programs requiring different actions in support of different forces. The key question becomes the achievement of a mass base, which is not just a numerical matter, but a matter of class representation. Given a mass base in the social struggle, the party does not necessarily have to suppress the internal play of political conflict, since the centrifugal force of political disagreements is counterbalanced by the centripetal pressure of the class struggle. And I've been describing this in past streams in terms of the kind of putting the ideas to the test of their utility in helping to guide the actual struggles of the working class, rather than being assessed on their own terms at the level of ideas. The problem was not the desire to engage in liberal activism. The problem with the base building tendency was not the desire to engage in liberal activism, what you might call liberal activism, in the sense that there's nothing specifically socialist about organizing people in society to address their discontents and meet their needs. That's something that is kind of part and parcel of liberal society, voluntary associations of people in society to meet their common ends. That's kind of the bread and butter of liberalism, including even things like trade unions, as I mentioned. I think I mentioned this in the interview with Doug Lane, but Adam Smith himself was able to recognize the need of workers to organize to defend their common interests against the opposed interests of the owners of stock. So the problem was not the desire to engage in liberal activism, but that the means of doing so was sectarian organization, whether that's DSA or these various little groups that were associated with the Marxist Center. Or rather, liberal activism became a means of building these sectarian organizations rather than a means of building a base in that sense. While they were trying to build a base of organized social action, that's what they kind of understood themselves to be doing. This was ultimately secondary to what was their immediate priority, namely cadre building, recruiting and training functionaries for their organization. They needed to sustain their organizations, and they were engaged in this activity in order to do that, rather than building organizations simply to facilitate this sort of activism. To the extent that their activist efforts were at all successful, they would feed into the existing base of the Democratic Party, the nonprofit activist organizations seeking to address social problems ultimately beyond their means, and hence begging the question of their relationship to politics and the state, with the serious activist elements preferring a pragmatic approach of finding the friendliest politicians and candidates or pressuring those most likely to yield. The sect provides no meaningful political alternative for such activists. So, the sectarian organizations, even if they play some role in the beginning, ultimately outlive their usefulness for the people that are serious about this sort of activism. Socialism in the end becomes an alibi for supporting the Democratic Party, both a rationale for supporting and participating in its social base, and for nullifying any meaningful political opposition by containing it in sterile sectarian organizations or sectish ideological conflicts between atomized individual sects of one. Now, perpetuating the identification. So let me back up for a moment. So the problem with the Jacobin strategy, as articulated by Sankara and Ackerman, is that it kind of does the opposite of what they are hoping to do. What they're hoping to do, and Sankara says this explicitly in the panel discussion, what they're trying to do is kind of raise the level of consciousness of class struggle and the need for socialism. And they're starting at a very low level, so they have to kind of take baby steps in this direction. They can't presuppose very much at all, and they can't just kind of lay the whole thing out there. So they have to kind of help people start moving in the direction of understanding these things. But the problem is with their approach is what they're actually doing is perpetuating the identification and confusion of socialism with the Democratic Party, even if that's only its left wing, so to speak. And hence, with the policies of a state party using state power to maintain the existing social order. And that goes as much for policies like the so-called, like the so to speak, the progressive aspirations of a New Deal or a Green New Deal, of going back to the New Deal and the Great Society, or for that matter, European social democratic welfare state type policies. As it goes as much for those sorts of policies as anything else. These are policies of a ruling party seeking to preserve its rule and the social order over which it rules by using state power, to cement its power in society. This is distinct from what from Marxist perspective, socialist politics should be. It should rather politics should rather cut across the terms of opposition of the Democratic and Republican parties. So, for example, the Democratic Party is seen as the political kind of tribune, and a poor one at that, but given the alternative, the tribune of organized labor, of the unions. Um, the Democratic Party is seen as the party of opposing racism and sexism amongst its supporters. However compromised and questionable these perspectives might be, that's what a lot of people who support the Democratic Party support it for. Similarly, with the Republican Party, the Republican Party stands for, at present, freedom of speech, the right to bear arms, lowering taxes, shrinking the size of the government, reducing government bureaucracy. opposing war. So those sorts of things, all of those sorts of things, are the kinds of things that could attract people to a socialist party. But if you make an appeal for socialism based on, uh, you know, taking one side of that opposition, it's going to distort these questions, because you would want to make an appeal that stands astride these divisions, and kind of leads to that kind of makes evident how false the nature of these divisions actually are. Moreover, it should appeal to the mass of people who are unmoved by electoral politics at present, who don't participate in electoral politics, even who aren't even moved by someone like Sanders or Trump to become engaged, or perhaps those that only would have voted for someone like Sanders or Trump. A party does not need to be electorally oriented, but it does need a reason to exist. So this is something that Ackerman kind of agonizes over with respect to the Labor Party example. What point is there to having a party if it's not engaging in electoral politics? Well, this gets to this question of the various phases of development of the class struggle and what model of party is appropriate at a given stage of development. Now, the kind of Jacobin perspective of the need to use electoral politics immediately as a means of beginning to move in the direction of an eventual rebirth of a working class movement and a left politics, a socialist politics, evinces a kind of impatience, a kind of need to leap over the present stage of development of the class struggle and kind of kickstart things in a way that ultimately leads them to compromise on a fundamental need to distinguish socialist politics, working class politics, from capitalist politics. And this whole point about the class struggle not being immediately evident is sort of it strikes a false note, because yeah, it's not, but you need to make it evident, and you could say, well, we need to kind of very gradually move in the direction of making an argument for independent working class politics. But all you end up doing in the process of in the process is muddying the water of, kind of, maybe you take a step in that direction, a very small step in that direction, but it doesn't really end up mattering because you're not drawing any clear lines of division. So all you're really doing is allowing whatever move you make in that direction to be sucked back in to this confusion or identification of socialism with the kind of state policies advocated by a certain fringe element of the Democratic Party. And it's ironic because Sankara in that panel discussion says we need to be very careful not to allow our politics to be sort of confused with a vague progressivism. But that's exactly what they're inviting, of course. They're not clarifying, but confusing, further confusing, reinforcing the existing confusion on these questions by taking it for granted rather than seeking to dispel it through their educational activity. So I'll wrap up my comments here. I've been going on about an hour now, and I'll wrap up by reading a brief section from the anatomy of the microsect article, which I find to be very helpful. Well, first, Draper says a working class party is not simply an electoral organization, but rather whether electorally engaged or not, an organization which really is the political arm of decisive sectors of the working class, which politically reflects or refracts the working class in motion as it is. He goes on, a socialist movement will become a possibility in this country, as it did in others, as its bases are matured by social political conditions. If, however, it cannot be created simply by an effort of will, it is also historically true that it is not simply a matter of spontaneous generation. When the bases for a socialist movement mature, it will be difficult for it to come into being unless the nascent movement is crystallized with the help of active socialist elements. Every socialist movement has been the outcome of the fusion of spontaneity and leadership, of naturally developed elements and conscious organization. This means that for us American socialists today, who look forward to the building of a genuine socialist movement, there is a course we can take which will further this objective and bring it nearer, which will fructify the ground on which it will arise, which will make it easier for its elements to mature from place to place. The alternative to creation by fiat is not that we passively wait for it to arise by itself without the intervention of human hands. It follows that the course taken now by American socialists can also have the opposite effect of turning off dispositions toward a genuine movement, of sterilizing the ground on which the seeds of the movement might germinate, of making it harder for workers to find their way to a socialist movement in the making. Unfortunately, this is the latter course. It is this latter course which today is dominant among the sects, sectlets, and microsects, and we might add the sects of one, of what passes nowadays as American socialism. The sect form of American socialist groupment today is a roadblock in the way, and the sect notions that are dominant among this groupment constitute a poison which could immobilize and abort a socialist movement even if it got started. So, in short, I think the problem with DSA ultimately is that it's a sect in this sense. And the Ackerman plan is really a plan to build a sect or to change the orientation of an existing sect without changing that kind of underlying sectarian character. The alternative that Draper poses is the political center, what he calls the political center. And it's not opposed in the sense that it's um, like there's sects and then there's political centers. Um, they're kind of different types of things, and sects function as political centers. It's part of what they do. But what a political center more generally is kind of a standpoint, a kind of political standpoint that propagates its views. And the kind of fundamental form that this takes for Draper is a publishing enterprise promoting political ideas, in this case, socialist ideas, and um, and cadre building on this basis. So so he says the creation, publication, and distribution of a basic body of literature is the accomplishment of a political center on which everything else depends. It is the key means to the end. The first task of this basic body of literature is to make possible the formation of the cadre, to provide political nourishment on which cadre can be raised. Without it, no healthy cadre formation is possible. So when Sankara describes this process of using electoral contests, both in with regards to the candidates themselves and the membership of DSA that are mobilized for the campaign in support of the candidate, as cadre building, this is sort of, this that's not wrong in a sense. They are cadre building, and they are nourished by the political ideas of Jacobin magazine, among other sources. But what kind of cadre are they building? They're building cadre for the Democratic Party. And they're doing that because they are not clarifying through this literature, through their ideas, the task of socialism and what it will take to rebuild a socialist movement in the sense that Draper describes. They are describing what appears necessary now, given extremely low state of the class struggle, and given the confusion over what socialism means, what class means, etc. They take this confusion for granted rather than seeking to dispel it, to challenge it, to educate people beyond it. And they reinforce that education in their activity, which takes for granted things that don't need to be taken for granted. Like, for example, the need to engage in electoral contests as Democrats on the Democratic ballot line or to support Democratic Party candidates for the sake of this kind of left populist revitalization that Sankara hopes for. Okay, so I'll conclude my remarks there. I think there's a lot more to talk about along these lines. But yeah, Clint, if you'd like to jump in, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, Reed. It sounds as though part of your critique is that the Jacobin DSA approach sort of took the worst of both worlds, both with respect to the activity of the working class and with respect to cadre building. So the activity just became about cadre building, but where it was actually about cadre building, it became just about an electoral progressivism. So to sort of flesh out what you were saying, we've got some questions in the chat. So Stejan wonders, is there not a serious cart before the horse situation here regarding a mass socialist party? Considering the almost complete absence of any real socialist kernel within society, is not the first organizational stage the necessity to build a truly vanguard socialist party, regardless of the sociological standing of the cadre? How could this possibly be considered sectarian in any sense?
Okay, so look, I don't know. I'm going to not try to pretend like I know what the solution to the problem of how to rebuild the socialist movement is. Um, I think there's a lot of merit to the perspective Draper puts forward, specifically in these pieces and in a few other places. And I think that merit is mostly derived. So we'll go into this in the future. I think it's derived from his experience, which is, I think, unique in a lot of ways, in that he lived through the kind of collapse and disintegration of the left twice in the course of his lifetime. First the old left and then the new left. And he played a pretty significant role in both of those moments. Um, and he learned, I think, a lot of really important lessons. But more important than that experience, because a lot of people had that experience, is the way he tried to ground that experience and understand it by turning back to Marx and to Lenin, and by essentially poring over everything Marx and Engels ever wrote and everything Lenin ever wrote in order to make sense of why did his generation and the generation he sought to mentor both go wrong, whereas Marx and Engels and Lenin, their generations, were able to do something that seemed impossible for his generation and for the generation after his. So I'm trying to essentially take Draper's perspective seriously as, on the one hand, I think it's just kind of valuable on its own terms, but it's also valuable as a way of helping to clarify what Marx and Engels were seeking to do in their moment, and for that matter, what Lenin was seeking to do in his moment, and how that differs from what the left has been doing since, say, the 1930s. Now, in terms of building, I think to go back to this question, I think trying to find the text of the question here. Cart for a horse situation. So in terms of, I think, yes, the absence of a socialist kernel, as you put it, is a real problem. Um, I mean, there is, in a sense, a socialist kernel, or a lot of socialist kernels, in that there are a lot of people out there who consider themselves socialists and who engage seriously with socialist ideas and who publish and promote and articulate and argue about those ideas publicly, in various forms. It's not a massive, and that's not massively influential phenomenon, but it is present in society. DSA, of course, being kind of, and Jacobin magazine for that matter, being probably among the most prominent forms it takes. Those are political centers in the way Draper's using the term. And it's not as if simply having a political center, as Draper describes it, on its own is like a solution or anything like that. Now, the thing to understand about these pieces is he's making these are really internal pieces. They're pieces. One is written as a polemic with members of the organization that he's involved with, which he soon after this ended up leaving. And he's essentially critiquing his organization for its kind of decline into sectarianism. And he's trying to say before he leaves, basically, look, it doesn't have to go this way. There is another way forward. This is what we could be doing instead. So he's taking for granted a particular political position. And I saw someone in the comments say something about how Draper's politics went to shit. I don't know exactly what he's referring to there. I don't agree with necessarily all of the political positions Draper takes. I mean, Draper, at the end of the day, was a Shachtmanite of maybe a left-wing Shachtmanite. And so he has a particular perspective on the Soviet Union and various other questions. I don't agree with everything that Draper espoused, but Draper, in articulating this road, this alternative road, this non-sectarian road, he's talking to his comrades in the IS, what became the International Socialists, earlier the Independent Socialist committees. And he's basically trying to say, look, we have this established political perspective that we agree upon, but the way we're trying to promote it is undermining what we're actually trying to do. And this is a different approach we could be taking. That's kind of what he's saying. So, leaving aside what his actual politics are, I do agree with him on a lot of issues, but I think a political center of the Marxist type, in the sense that's trying to promote a Marxist perspective, is something that I would take seriously as a potential way forward. Of course, there are plenty of, so to speak, so-called Marxist political centers by Draper's definition. He lists some, so there's like Monthly Review, and others. There are publications that publicize their Marxist perspective. But the question of what constitutes Marxism, it's a hairy question that I don't want to get into at the moment. I would say if we're looking at, say, the perspective as articulated by Monty Johnstone in his discussion of the party, in terms of what would it take to build a party along the lines of the socialist parties of the Second International, it would probably take the kind of perspective that Marx and Engels had. And so a political center propagating that kind of view is something I would take seriously. I would want to be part of. In a sense, it's kind of what I'm trying to do with this project in a very elementary, provisional way. So yes, but in terms of building an organization, that depends on what we mean, I guess. Draper's critique, which he bases on Marx's critique of sectarian organization, is that membership organization is an ineffective way of propagating one's political views. It worked in certain situations in history, but that is not really a testament to the sectarian form of organization itself, because that form of organization was rather quickly left behind. So the the utopian socialist sects were influential in their moment, but their influence was only really felt when that form of organization was superseded with Chartism, as Mike McNair points out in that panel discussion. Similarly, like LaSalle built a working class party in Germany, and Marx and Engels lauded him for that, but they criticized him because the way he built the party was essentially as a sectarian organization. And ultimately, the significance of LaSalle's party was only cashed out when the sectarian approach that LaSalle and his successor Schweitzer were insisting upon was left behind, as the Lassallean organization kind of disintegrated, and what remained of it was merged into the Marxist, what became the Social Democratic Party of Germany. So what do we mean by organization? If we mean an organization in the more general sense, of an so what Draper describes like a publishing enterprise would be an organization in a sense. It wouldn't be a party in the sense of a political organization, that is the real expression of a mass working class movement, but it would be, if it has this kind of Marxist perspective, at least, of the need for the working class to organize itself as an independent political force and to conquer political power. It would be, in Johnstone's sense, a party in the process of formation or a party embryo, right? So, what do we mean, and what do we mean by organization? I'm not necessarily, I think there's a good argument that trying to build a sort of membership organization is a dead end. That yes, membership organizations have a certain utility when they are brought into existence to facilitate forms of activity that can't be effectively organized in an ad hoc, spontaneous manner, right? So they become necessary at a certain point. It becomes necessary to have an organization with members that can act as functionaries on behalf of that organization. But do we need that right now? Well, if we need a publishing enterprise that can publicize its views, it needs, people that can do the work involved in that. But do they have to be members of an organization, or can they be, can that be, so is it like a matter of evangelizing, of trying to win over, to recruit members to a membership organization, or is it more of a matter of, an enterprise in the bourgeois sense of, a group of people that are seeking to produce a commodity, so to speak, right? And put it out there. You're not trying to recruit everyone in society to join your enterprise. You only need enough people to produce the thing you're trying to produce, and you really don't want any more people than that. Now, then there's the question of what Draper describes as agents, the various agents. So people that are influenced by these ideas, that take these ideas seriously, that maybe agree with some of them, maybe disagree with some of them, but play a role in helping to propagate these ideas and maybe to explore their implications with respect to their, practical valences in social struggles. That's a whole nother question. How do you relate to these people? Draper is saying, well, it would be much better to relate to them in a kind of a relatively free manner where you're not forcing them to agree with everything, up front, and you're not holding them to some kind of organizational discipline, but rather you're trying to develop relationships in a kind of, well, so we're getting into the details of his proposal, but the point I'm trying to make here is I think there's a good argument in Draper for, yes, doing what you're trying to say, in the sense of organizing the vanguard, socialist vanguard, as a kind of kernel that can propagate its ideas and, as Draper puts it, crystallize potential, a potential socialist movement as its base is mature. But then the question is, what form of organization does that take? Does it need to be a membership organization? I don't think so, and I am inclined to go with the example of, Marx and Lenin. Oh, and one more point I want to make, and then we can move on, is that, so McNair in the panel talks about how the SDP in its early days was relatively small. It was somewhat comparable in size to what DSA is now. He's talking in terms of membership, of course, but that's not really the point of the size of an organization. So as Draper puts it, these organizations, these parties didn't reckon their size in terms of the number of members they had. Members were functionaries. They were people that did work on behalf of the party. But the size of the party is the size of the base of support the party has in society. And so you reckon that through things like the circulation numbers of the party's publications, by the size of the mass meetings that the party is able to organize, the demonstrations the party is able to organize, by the voter turnout for the party's candidates, things like that. It's not the number of members that the party has. That's not what is meant by size here. Does DSA have a comparable influence to what the DP did in, say, the 1870s? I don't think so. But then again, that's a very different context. So it's kind of hard to make that comparison anyway. Okay, sorry. Let's maybe move on here, unless Clint, you
No,
have.
no, I think that's good. And I think so. Stajon 73 is kind of opening up an interesting line of thought here by asking about the DOP. Um, so because he says, how can once anyone seriously label themselves a socialist unless there's an unequivocal commitment to the dictatorship of the proletariat? It's a red line to discard the wheat from the chaff and the foe from the real. So one critique that one might have of DSA Jacobin is how they explicitly reject the notion that the state can wither away, that the dictatorship of the proletariat is itself desirable, that the capitalist state has become too big and strong to imagine its dismantling. So and one could also imagine that at the same time there might be Trotskyist and Maoist sects who are sectarian precisely in the way that they're insisting on this sort of political programmatic independence of the working class, which becomes a way of recapitulating their own organizations. So how is it? How might this rejection of the DOP, so to speak, by DSA Jacobin actually be contributing to the sectarian character that it actually ends up embodying?
So it's interesting to put it that way, because I would say for one thing, it's very easy to imagine socialists who are not committed to the dictatorship of the proletariat, because socialism did not emerge with this, commitment to the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat in the first place. And throughout the history of the socialist movement, there were, socialists. There was never a time until, I suppose, the 1890s, 1880s, 1890s, where socialist was synonymous with the notion that the working class should take political power, and only on the basis of the political rule of the working class could the transition to socialism be politically, undertaken. That was not the only socialist perspective throughout history. It certainly isn't today. There's plenty of socialists or people who call themselves socialists. Now, you could say, are they really socialists? Well, I don't know. I'm not really interested in adjudicating whether or not someone's really a socialist. What I'm interested in is what Marx was interested in, which was the phenomenon of proletarian socialism, in the sense of the interest that the proletarian, working class movement, in from its emergence as an independent movement seeking to pursue its independent interests as opposed to the interests of the capitalist class, and specifically its interests politically, as a politically opposed to the interests of the capitalist class, the interest that that movement had in socialist ideas. So what was the interest of the socialist ideas for the proletariat, in the sense of the organized working class movement, specifically in its political form, Chartism, but also in its economic form, the trade unions and cooperatives and other forms? The interest of socialism was in helping it think through the nature of its struggle and the ultimate consequences of that struggle. So the socialist ideas helped the working class movement understand what the nature of this fundamental problem in society was, that was the basis of their struggle, that led to the problems that they were struggling with, and what a transformation of society at that fundamental level might entail, such that that task of undertaking that transformation was the task of the working class movement in its political struggle, right? So in a sense, you could say it's, in a sense, you could say that the goal of the dictatorship of the proletariat precedes the commitment to socialism. Although I wouldn't use the term dictatorship of the proletariat here, because it's not necessarily a revolutionary conception per se, although it is, incipiently, let's say, revolutionary. The initial commitment of the Chartist, the working class Chartists, to this goal of not just democratic reform, but democratic reform for the sake of wielding political power in their own interests, in the interests of their class. That commitment of taking political power was, of course, the workers. There was already a lot of interest in socialism among the working class movement. In fact, I believe the guy, I can't remember his name, but the guy who wrote the original charter, the six demands in the charter, was an Owenite socialist. Um, but there was a lot of socialist elements in the working class movement. But socialism only really became significant. It became significant for Marx, certainly, as a means of the working class striving to clarify why it was moved into this struggle to take political power, what its task was to that end. And of course, the way Marx clarifies this issue, and not just on the basis of his his early understanding of this phenomenon, but as specifically clarified through the experience of the Revolution of 1848 and the failure of the proletarian socialist movement in the course of that revolution. The clarification of the dictatorship of the proletariat in those terms. That is like, that's a really important move, critical move that Marx is posing both against the other socialist tendencies, right? Like the non-proletarian socialists, the kind of conservative socialists and petty bourgeois socialists and so on. But he's also posing it, most importantly, it's a critique of the proletarian socialist movement itself. It's a critique of their lack of clarity over the task that they are attempting to think through in terms of the struggle for socialism. That's really the point of all of that. That's a pretty advanced understanding of the problem, right? That's a very advanced. So that presupposes already the merger of the socialist movement and the workers' movement. Today, we have something like a socialist movement, you could say, although, it's just pretty sorry by comparison to, say the early socialist movement of the 1820s and 30s. But you could say there's some kind of socialist movement today. The labor movement, the working class movement, is, as Bhaskar Sankara puts it, I think correctly, is hollowed out. To the extent that it still exists at all, its institutions are hollowed out. And it's not just hollowed out, but a lot of it is just gone. And it's gone not just in terms of like the institutions and organizations are gone, but even the memory of it is gone. Like, people don't even understand this history at all. It's just gone. It's forgotten. Or worse, it's remembered in really, detrimental ways. Unions are seen as essentially organized crime and so on. So, I think we could aspire to arguments about this question, but so going back to the Johnstone for a moment, he talks about these early phases in the development of the party concept and how initially what Marx and Engels understand by the party, when they use that term in their early phase, they're referring essentially to themselves and people that agree with them, right? A société de pensée, right? A like group of like-minded people. And what they're essentially trying to do is spread their ideas among the socialist and revolutionary currents, especially of, specifically of German emigre radicals, but also more broadly amongst, these various kinds of radical democratic reformers and socialists and communists and all these different elements that are kind of in the mix, and which you could say are, constitutive of this socialist movement at this relatively early phase. Of course, in Britain, it's a little bit different because you have Chartism, you have a relatively mature working class movement, but in the German context, let alone, the German context is especially retarded, but the French, Belgian, Swiss, all of these different European countries are behind, in the sense that they have all these radical socialist elements, and they have maybe the beginnings of some working class organization and struggle, but it's not anything like what they have in England. So it presupposes the merging of these elements. Now we are lacking, you know, a core element of that. So what could we do? Well, we could do what Marx and Engels did in the communist correspondence committees, which was seeking to promote their views amongst the socialist radicals, you know, in an effort to clarify their confusion, you know, as Marx puts it, an effort to clarify the confusion of the reformers. And that's of course only one task. There's also the task of influencing the working class. But do we have, I mean, who's the we in question here? I mean, it's not like there's even, I don't even assume the people watching this are necessarily agreeing with me. So it's really me saying this. But do we hypothetically have a mass of people that are so committed to these ideas that they would spread them amongst the working class somehow? No. So what we really need right now is cadre that are willing to promote these ideas, you know, to take them up, to debate them, to think about them, to you know, counter argue against them. And in that sense, this whole question of the dictatorship of the proletariat and Marxism, I think these are arguments worth having. But that, you know, are they worth having or are they not? I mean, I think they're worth having, but I think generally speaking, contemporary socialists are so deeply confused. Maybe not all of them, and maybe not the younger ones that are just becoming acquainted with these ideas, but those that have become more thoroughly committed are so thoroughly confused and so committed to their confusion that I'm not necessarily hoping to like win over a lot of people in DSA, so to, you know, for example, or to win over people in Jacobin. I'm more oriented towards people that are just learning about this stuff and that are relatively open, you know, or people that are have more acquainted but have more open-minded, maybe discontented with what they see around them. But you know, I do think it's worth arguing about these ideas. Ultimately, you're never going to convince anyone of the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat on the basis of a theoretical argument, or you're only going to convince very few people. You know, it will take a relatively high level of development of the class struggle, including its, you know, merger with the socialist movement, its crystallization around socialist ideas, not just Marx's idea, you know, not just this Marxist idea, but more generally the idea of a rational organization of society on the, you know, to the end of promoting the happiness and full development of every individual rather than this kind of haphazard, anarchic, destructive development of capitalism. That's socialism in a general sense, right? This idea of a rational reorganization of society to promote, on the basis of the kinds of transformative forces unleashed by the Industrial Revolution, to promote the full development of all individuals in society rather than the feeding of the majority, the immense majority of people into like a meat grinder that destroys them over the course of their lives and leaves them with nothing to show for it, you know. Okay, so I'll leave that
So
point there.
could you speak then to the educational function of the political center?
Mhm.
If it's not a sort of missionary work to the working class on the basis of a like membership based sectarian programmatic line.
So the best example, I think, is an example. So the best example from, and again, so this is so you back up for a moment. So, you know, Johnstone talks about how Marx and Engels take their examples from what's actually happening instead of trying to develop some idea to impose upon the world, right? So they have these various models of the party that they find ready to hand, and they see them as kind of expressions of this underlying historical dynamic, this kind of evolutionary development. And their perspective is to kind of help move these forms forward, right, on the basis of this longer view perspective, like to help them advance to the next phase of their development. So in terms of precursors of political organization, I think there's a similar argument to be made that, it's all well and good to kind of come up with ideas, but it's more important to, I think, look to the actual examples of what's out there. Now, that's why in previous videos I've made a point of emphasizing the trade unions, and Draper does as well, because that's really all there is left in terms of working class organization. And that's a pretty poor, what we have left is pretty poor. It's hollowed out, again, as Bhaskar puts it. The trade unions are mostly hollowed out. Um, but if we look to historical examples, it's not just trade unions, right? There's other forms of working class organization. There's a lot of them. There's a lot of different forms, and they take, a variety of they change over the course of their development. But a prominent form that plays a central role both in Marx and Engels, participation in the Communist League, and then later in the formation of the Social Democratic Party, are the workers' educational organizations or workers' educational associations. So these were organizations that were first developed in Germany and then among German emigres outside of Germany, um, by liberals that were seeking to win over the working class to their political cause. So to liberal reforms in the Prussian Empire, and maybe in some circles even Republican demands for Republican or Democratic reforms. But as Marx and Engels never tire of um, saying, the German liberal bourgeoisie is utterly cowardly and unmanly and unable to rise to the sort of stature of the English and French bourgeoisie. But nonetheless, so liberal reformers in Germany organized these workers' educational associations, in essentially to win the workers over to their cause and use them to support their cause, to win their support to their reformist uh, aspirations. Um, so the purpose of these organizations was, as the name implies, educational. There was no public school, and the working class didn't have access to any other kind of schooling. So these were essentially voluntary civil society organizations that did things like, they had classes, like courses, like the kind of courses you would have in school, and they also hosted regular public lectures. They had reading rooms. They distributed literature. They would provide spaces where people could get together and discuss what's in the newspaper, where people could have the newspaper read to them. A lot of working class people are illiterate at this point or barely literate, so they could have newspapers read to them or pamphlets, books read to them. They could attend lectures, and then a variety of other activities would grow out of this. So sports clubs and singing groups and theater clubs and a variety of other organizations. Friendly societies like mutual aid societies would grow out of these. Early forms of trade union organizing would grow out of these. But the elementary form of these organizations were educational in nature. So, and again, originally they were put together by liberal reformers, but first in the 1840s and then later again in the 1860s, the liberal reformers kind of receded from participation in these organizations, basically out of recognition that as the working class was developing its own kind of as working class people were developing kind of political perspectives, they weren't becoming kind of closer to the liberals, but they were taking up the sorts of radical ideas of the socialists. And more generally, they were taking up, uh, they were kind of seeking to address their concerns in a manner that opposed them to the kinds of reforms that the liberal bourgeoisie was promoting. So there was kind of a growing distance between these liberal reformers and the workers. But the socialists then took up the cause of organizing these worker educational associations, and that was the primary kind of activity that the Communist League was engaged in, was organizing workers' educational associations. So there was one in London. I think there was probably more than one in London, but there was one in Soho, where Marx and Engels both lectured, as part of their participation in the Communist League. Um, so this was kind of the elementary form of working class organization. And this was how Marx and Engels, as a political center, so to speak, were propagating their views among the workers, right? And it wasn't just in London, it was on the continent as well. So they would correspond with other members of the league, and they would kind of seek to advance their ideas through these educational associations to promote their views. And then basically the same pattern was present in the 1860s, around the time of the formation of the Lassallean Party and then the Marxist Eisenach Party. This was what these parties did. They did stand candidates for election. That was one of their activities, but they were standing candidates because they had a base of support that wanted to have candidates to vote for, right? That were looking for candidates to vote for. And where did this support come from? It came from the workers' educational associations and other clubs, but the educational associations were central, right? A lot of the other kinds of forms of organization grew out of them. So this was like really the core of the party's activity. It had newspapers, it published pamphlets, it organized lecture circuits, public meetings, to discuss these ideas and promote these ideas. And it organized educational associations that would host regular lectures, host classes, promote, distribute and provide access to literature, and more generally provide a forum in which the workers could associate amongst themselves and discuss their interests and the ideas relevant to their interests, as workers. That was central. And it was on this basis that political representation became a viable option. And of course, what was the electoral activity? It was really just continuing this kind of activity in a broader forum, right? So instead of just lecturing to people that were seeking to get educated and specifically to be educated in these, political ideas, they would be making a broader appeal to the whole electorate, right? So they would be lecturing not just to people seeking out socialist ideas or seeking out, this political education, but to everyone in society, potentially. So they were extending their reach, but they were really doing the same thing. They were traveling around, distributing pamphlets, printing newspapers and distributing newspapers, and lecturing. That's what they did. And that's what the campaign trail was. It was traveling around lecturing in support of your candidacy. Both the candidate himself and, other members of the party would travel around lecturing in support of the candidate. And the workers' educational associations, and then the unions that they helped organize, and these other organizations as well, would reinforce that. They would provide a basis for that organizational activity. But so, as I was saying earlier, when do you need something like a membership organization? You need it when you have something as serious as this sort of activity to organize, right? You don't need it to publish a newspaper necessarily. You don't need it to publish pamphlets necessarily. But if you get a big enough base of support that you have people that want you to run regular lectures, not just in a particular place, but traveling around, a region, and that want you to run for political office and so on, to organize unions, that requires a greater degree of organizational resources and commitment from the people involved than the sort of hang loose formation of, Société de Pensée, kind of thing that Draper is pointing to. That would amount to a development beyond this early phase, right? But it would be catalyzed around the political center. It would be crystallizing around the political center as a kind of an emergent necessity on the basis of the development of both the activity inspired by these ideas and directed by these ideas, and the ideas themselves as they take on a life of their own within the working class movement, among the workers, rather than as the province of this kind of coterie of intellectuals with their, printing press.
Yeah, and one wonders with the serious decline of both public education, liberal academia, and liberal journalism, if such a civil
Absolutely.
social need might be necessary. So Stejan wants to bring this point home. So, Reed, I apologize if this is not as intense. Seems close to be saying that most wage laborers can't be convinced of the need of the DOPs to advance. I disagree. There is a misconception that it is difficult for organizers to put complex matter into easier ways to understand. Reed could stand on a picket line and convince people seriously. We need to get over this. This is 2022 with a huge failure, with a huge history of left failures Marx wasn't aware of. I think the question is not so much like convincing individual workers or even convincing numbers of people. The question is the organizational form that takes. A bunch of people who are independently convinced of the need to overthrow capitalism or political independence of the working class does not mean this per se. But I'll let you respond to that, Reed.
If you want to stand on a picket line and try to convince, the striking workers of the need for the dictatorship of the proletariat, by all means do that. I mean, I'm not going to do that, not because I don't think that's like a good idea necessarily, but that's just not so anecdotally, um in his correspondence, in his late life when he's living in London, Engels makes a remark to the effect that, given the kind of very low level of working class struggle and organization in England, that this is actually a good thing because it means he doesn't have to worry about, engaging in agitation, and like propagating his ideas in that sense. And he can just kind of sit back and do the theoretical work that he's best at. And Marx and Engels made similar remarks with respect to the collapse of the revolutionary movements in the 1850s after the failure of the revolution of 1848, that it freed them up to do their theoretical work, which was for them, that was their central contribution, right? They thought that was much more important than any kind of agitational work that they might do because that wasn't their strong suit. Their strong suit was theoretical work. There's other people that were much better suited to doing agitation than Marx and Engels were. And thank God, but, Engels is like, it's a good thing that I don't have to do that kind of stuff because it lets me just write my books, and these books are very important. Editing volumes 2 and 3 of Das Kapital is very important. It needs to be done. Writing the anti-Düring, writing the Feuerbach book, writing The Origin of the Family and Private Property in the State. Those are central contributions that, thank God, he had the time to do that, right? At least that was his perspective. And then there's people like Liebknecht and Babel, and Kautsky for that matter. I mean, Engels says at one point, you know, it's a shame that there's nobody that can really take on Marx and my role in the movement because even those that are like most capable of doing this theoretical work, like Kautsky, he has to write for a living. He has to write, he has to earn money with his writing. So he has to, he can't just freely engage in theoretical activity, on his own terms. He has to write for whatever's going to, get him money. Um, and of course, for Kautsky, that means writing for the party press. Um, so, there is this perspective that there is something good about being separated from the real movement. It gives you space to do necessary work. But that's not to say that Marx and Engels thought like everyone should be doing what they're doing, or that's the only thing that needs to be done, or that that's sufficient unto itself. No, of course not. There needs to be a whole host of different things going on. But Draper's point is that the articulation of this political perspective and its propagation as a kind of body of literature that can provide the basis of a political education is essential. Of course, there's plenty of those already out there. There are plenty of political centers, both historical and contemporary. There's Jacobin, there's others out there producing literature that provides political education. Bad political education, obviously, confusing political education, miseducation, you might say, right? But there are people out there doing it. If you're committed to this kind of Marxist conception, then you should want someone doing that. Now, there are other, more hardcore sectarian groups that are ostensibly more committed to like orthodox Marxism and that criticize DSA and Jacobin along those lines. But are they actually effectively doing what they're trying to do? I mean, I know people that are members of like Orthodox Trotskyist organizations that go to picket lines with their signs and with their newspapers and that stand on the picket lines and they talk to the workers there. And I'm sure they probably get, their ideas across to some of them. I'm not saying that that's worthless, but what I'm saying is that the only way in which these ideas can be propagated by doing that? I certainly don't think so. And I think that that activity ultimately is kind of self undermining in the sense that they're really restricting the range of their appeal insofar as they are focused on trying to win over workers by ones and twos, rather than, trying to recruit workers to their perspective, rather than trying to elevate the level of discussion of socialist ideas among the socialists first and foremost, because of course, no worker is ever going to be interested in socialism if what they know about socialism comes from the likes of like DSA, right? Or if they are interested, then what they're really going to be interested in is not socialism, but the Democratic Party, right? Democratic Party progressivism. So, you know, fine, go to this picket line, do it. But I'm not in any rush to like try to build the Revolutionary Party as quickly as possible because I just don't think that's how this works. I don't think there's any historical precedent for that. And I do think there are good reasons to think that the kind of approach that Draper is recommending here is a much more reasonable and sober approach that has historical precedence in its favor. Um, so
And
that's my take.
and it seems to be that like what it's showing, it's revealing practically and in society that only the working class can really take responsibility for basic liberalism. And I think that's why these educational workers, workers educational societies, even trade unions, like this is liberalism. And that would have to be shown. Then part of what the political education would be is about bringing the to a higher sort of debated and theoretical self-consciousness of the limitations that are necessarily being run up against.
Right. Right. But I mean, yes, of course, on a conceptual level, or even at the level of their struggle, like workers on strike, of course you could appeal to them on the basis of these ideas. Of course you could make the argument, shouldn't the workers be in charge? Shouldn't the workers organize themselves and take power and get rid of these capitalist politicians? I'm sure you could make that argument to a lot of people. You might have to, play around with the terminology or the rhetoric a little bit. But yeah, worker on strike especially, I'm sure would be receptive to that sort of idea. But how many workers are out there on strike? You know? I mean, how many? Not many. Not many. And though, and the ones that aren't on strike, I'm not saying that like none of them are going to be receptive to these ideas or be able to understand them, but I think a lot of them just won't want to be bothered with your political ideas. I think the point would be to try to get them looking for these ideas. You want them looking for these ideas, right? And right now, so as Clinton was just saying, like the point would be that the workers are the ones that are going to be, trying to constitute liberal society in the sense of seeking to like think through these, ideas about how society could change and what the leadership of society could look like and how to address these problems and so on. That sort of discussion, I'm sure it could bloom amongst working class people in this country. Like, so there's a lot of arguments about why is the working class depoliticized and why has it become conservative or apathetic or whatever. There's a lot of reasons, a lot of contributing factors to that. But I would say a core reason is the abdication of the socialist movement in its leadership of the working class, um, and its liquidation of socialism into the Democratic Party. I think a big reason why working class people are politically apathetic was because the politics of the working class was liquidated by the very people that were supposed to be promoting it, over the course of several decades in several different phases, to the point where now socialism for the vast majority of people is synonymous with the capitalist state. It's synonymous with what the capitalist state does to maintain its power in society and to maintain the existing social order. That's what socialism means to most people when they hear that term. It means the welfare state. It means state intervention, state regulation of the economy. It means, whatever. It means, all sorts of different things. But ultimately, what it means to them is political domination by the existing ruling class, really. You hear conservatives talk about socialism these days, and that's like what they'll say. They'll say socialism is an ideology of the ruling class. That's what they say. Conservatives say this, and they're not saying it because they're crazy. They're saying it because that's what the people they're talking to already think, you know? And, sure, some of the people that think it's a good thing. Some of the people who think that think, yeah, the state should do more. Yeah, there should be more welfare programs. Yeah, there should be more regulation. Yeah, the state should take a bigger role. There should be higher taxes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Some people think that. People that Jacobin speaks to think that. People in DSA think that. And a lot of working class people think that. And a lot of working class people think that and think that's why they don't want socialism. Because they don't like the way things already are. They don't want it further propped up. They don't want the state to get even bigger and have an even more profound role in society, to take even more money out of society in the form of taxation, not only taxation of their income, but also of their employers, because they see that as deleterious to them. Because when their employers are taxed, or when the people that produce the things they need to live are taxed, they end up paying for it. The workers end up paying for it. It's not the capitalists that end up paying for the taxes. It ends up at the end of the day, whether out of their paycheck or out of their, on the receipts for their food bill, that's where they're paying it back. So yes, I mean, of course you can convince working class people of these ideas, but the point isn't to do it at the level of ideas alone, in the sense that you could talk to someone, and have a deep conversation and eventually move them to see the merit of your ideas and maybe even to agree with you. And certainly someone who's in an agitated, confrontational position, like someone on strike, would be more inclined to be receptive to those sorts of ideas. The point would be to get masses of workers not only more receptive to these ideas, but clamoring for this sort of education, to be begging for it, demanding it, to the point that they themselves are organizing the educational associations, the lecture circuits, the printing, publication operations, the political campaigns, the unions, the strikes. They should be doing it, right? So that's what we need to see. And we can't just snap our fingers and make that happen. And we're not going to make that happen by talking to people about how we should have the dictatorship of the proletariat. We're not. That could help contribute to, that sort of development, promoting those ideas. But if you isolate those ideas in a membership organization that has the liabilities of seeking to sustain itself as a membership organization, and that hence is, on the one hand, opposing itself to the level of understanding of regular people by seeking to, in a sense, um, in a sense, speak the truth and win over people to the truth, rather than seeking to push people beyond where they presently are, based on what they already believe and what they already understand, seeking to move them forward rather than seeking to kind of have them climb all the way up the hill to the highest possible position. And that, on the other hand, will ultimately be driven to compromise whatever its perspective is in order to sustain itself. That's the sort of liability that, certainly I think there's a lot of reason to think there's no real warrant in perpetuating. There's no real need to continue doing the same thing we've been doing for a century now in the hopes that it will suddenly start working when it hasn't worked for a century. Draper's argument is this is not what the socialists, not what the Marxists and other socialists, of course, there were sectarian socialists in the 19th century, and the Marxists polemicized against them. But this isn't how the socialist movement became a mass movement of the working class. And this is not how the Marxists became leaders of the working class socialist movement. It wasn't on the basis of sectarian membership organizations. It was on the basis of promoting and propagating their ideas amongst other socialists and amongst the workers where they found an audience. And not in a form that, that in a sense walled itself off behind an organizational barrier, but that sought to propagate its views as widely as possible and as in as an intelligible a manner as possible for the masses that they were speaking to. That doesn't mean dumbing down your ideas. That doesn't mean suppressing the full, extent of your ideas. But it does mean doing what a publishing enterprise seeks to do, which is speak to the audience it can expect to find, right? And to, in this sense, help its audience develop its perspective through not just the publication efforts, but through the educational activity that is based upon them.
All right. Thank you, Reed. We're at our 2-hour mark. You can catch Reed every Tuesday to do exactly what he's talking about.
I will. I mentioned earlier, but the next 2 weeks we won't be streaming. We will be back July 12th, and then we'll recommence our regular streams then. But check me out on Derek Varn's YouTube channel on the 10th or afterwards. It's when our interview goes up. And, I don't mean to be strident in my response to these questions. You kind of got me going a little bit, Stajan. They're good questions. I mean, they're really good and worth engaging with. And I'm sorry we didn't really get to, I think there might have been a few other questions we didn't get to.
There was a question about the socialist alternative.
Maybe we could talk about that again in the future if whoever asked that question wants to bring it up next time. But these are good conversations we had, and frankly, I don't want it to necessarily be a one-way conversation. I'd be happy to have other people on to talk it out if you'd be willing to do that. But we can talk about that in the future. I just, this is my political center. So you're going to listen to what I have to say if you're tuning in. But, I want to hear what you have to say too. I'm interested in hearing from you guys also. So.
Awesome. Yep. And Sublation is hopefully building up that ecosystem now. So tell all your friends.
Right. Exactly.
All right.
Write for Sublation if you disagree with me. Okay. Sorry.
Yes. Publish it in print.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Clint. Thanks, everyone.
Until next time. Thanks, everybody.